Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this latest teaching session in the course on technology and the future of medicine. Today, the student presentations continue, and right now, Alexandria Renoir is going to talk to us about the global rise in income inequality propelled by prominent trends and accelerated technological change. Take it away.
Well, that was the longest title ever. So as some of you guys may know, I don't really come from a science background at all. So I kind of took this final project as an opportunity to incorporate some of my finance background into it. So I apologize in advance for all of the graphs. I think my business student is showing a little bit too much in this one, but I chose to discuss the current trends in the global increase in income inequality and kind of how that's related to accelerated technological change. So we'll start here. I'm sure everyone's seen this graph before. It's kind of just the distribution of household income. This one's focused on the United States. And we can see that starting in 1970-ish, like everyone's income kind of increased around the same pace. Then all of a sudden something happened. All of a sudden in 2007, the top 1% of earners earned like upwards of 300% more than the people at the bottom of the economy. So like, the question really is, like, why would this happen? Like, what's causing this huge income polarization within the United States and just around the world as well? So I will go into this topic first by looking at the historical trends in income inequality around the world, kind of maybe what spurred it and that sort of thing. Then a definition of accelerated technological growth and the implications and potential outcomes of that going forward if we remain on this path. Then after that, just kind of different areas our society could go into regarding singularity. That's where I'm going to focus. Even though there are many other opportunities and other areas we could go, that's the area that I chose to look at. And just generally how technology and income are kind of really correlated and really related in that sense. So back to this graph, we can kind of look at the history here and see that there are main areas where the income gap really increases for the top 1%. And those are just during times when there's kind of big things going on in the economy. The top 1% of earners can really capitalize on those things. But we can also see that they also have the most fluctuations in their growth rate of their income compared to the bottom earners. Hypothetically, in a society, everyone's income should be growing at the same rate. There's really no reason for this, but obviously we can see that's not the case. We also should note that this is a percent increase graph, so even if everyone started or had the equal percentages, a 5% increase in $100 is a lot more than a 5% increase in $1. So when the income inequality thing kind of came onto the forefront of political and economic circles was during the Occupy Wall Street movement in 2011. Now some people really started realizing that this income polarization was happening and that it was a big issue in the United States and around the world. So as I said before, I focused on the United States, but we can see all OECD countries have experienced a rise in inequality. This is measured by the Gini index, which is kind of like a global benchmark for income inequality. One being perfect inequality, that one person holds all the wealth where everyone else has nothing, and 0 being perfect equality. So then we can move on to see the causes of these Gini movements. So as I said, everywhere in the world has experienced movements increasing the income disparity. So those main reasons that people have agreed on would be globalization, global trade, welfare spending, and technology. In terms of globalization, this just means people have access to cheap labor, whereas before, not as much. Same with global trade and welfare spending. Those actually have a negative impact on the Gini index. But as we can see, technology really has the greatest effect on the increase in this index, and that's for developing nations and undeveloped nations alike. We can kind of say that this is just due to the fact that technology kind of applies to everything. So it applies to global trade, it applies to globalization, it applies across all areas. And then we can also see that everyone kind of agrees that technology is the driving force behind this rise in inequality. This graph is from Alan Kruger's presentation in 2011, just on income disparity. And kind of like, I guess from an economic perspective, the more you automate things, the more technology you have, the more profit you make. The more profit you make, the more technology you can afford, and the less workers you need, or the less you have to pay the workers. So you're making more money, the workers are making less money. It just really increases it in that way. And then back to the whole developing versus developed nations, we can use China as an example, that most people would think that technology would kind of raise income of everyone, whereas it's really focused in urban areas, and somewhere like China with a lot of rural areas, the technology boom and increase just raises those areas more, and then the urban areas are kind of left behind, and that increases the gap even more. So now we'll go into the definition of accelerated change. So it's just kind of a rapid increase, and based on historical trends in technology and just kind of the whole doubling effect in Moore's law, we can see that technology really does kind of follow this accelerated path versus a linear path. So yeah, that's really important to say that like the income inequality is really influenced by this, I guess you could say. So implications of this accelerated growth going forward would be just the demand for skills increase, so the middle class decline. What this means is that as technology increases, jobs become more skill-oriented versus work-oriented, just kind of back in the manufacturing revolution. Before everything was done manually, then all of a sudden everything's done by machines. Now everything's kind of done by intelligent machines. People are slowly being phased out, and the demand for skills increases, same with the demand for education. And this kind of causes limited economic mobility, the relationship between the Gini coefficient, so again, that's the measure of inequality, versus the level of economic mobility is shown here in the Great Gatsby curve, it's known as. And we can see Canada's actually relatively placed well compared to the United States on this graph. I know there's a bunch of countries on there, but you kind of see it. And just the relationship here is that kind of more, as inequality increases more, only people that are higher in the inequality spectrum can afford education, and they are the ones with skills. So the gap just keeps getting wider and wider, and the middle class just keeps declining. And this kind of just leads to stratification in society. So people at the top have access to education, have access to technology, whereas people at the bottom don't, and people just get kind of stuck in this, I guess you could call it a class caste system of the past. So potential outcomes that could relate to this exponential growth in technology, like I said, I'm going to focus kind of on the singularity outcome, and I'm going to base it off of this definition here, saying just that it's a hypothetical movement in time when artificial intelligence has progressed to the point of a greater than human intelligence, radically changing civilization. And then it goes on to say that technological singularity is often seen as an occurrence between the future course of human history, or where the future course of human history is unpredictable or even unfathomable. So basically what this is saying, that we can't even begin to think about where technology is going to go or where society is going to go. We really can't comprehend it. So even though this guy says that we can't analyze it and can't make predictions about it, I'm going to try to do that anyway. So first I'll start with the 2045 self-fulfilling prophecy. Just the fact that so many people are focusing on the year 2045 really increases the chance that technological singularity will happen in this year. These are from multiple websites saying that singularity is going to happen in 2045, 2045, 2045. This is, yeah, like I said, just because the more focus that you place on it, the more likely that it will occur in that year. And the 2045 year is kind of just chosen by extrapolating trends in technological growth that we've seen historically. So like I mentioned, one of the outcomes of this rapid growth in income polarization, or sorry, regardless of income polarization, would be a utopian society, where an intelligence explosion is kind of defined by a biointelligence, artificial intelligence, economic intelligence, kind of them just working together and creating this great society for everyone to live in. A superhuman race could emerge where everyone is young, immortal, forever, there's no poverty, all that sort of stuff. And we can just kind of base this on historical trends, that everything from religion to politics has been focused on kind of creating this utopian society, and the reason that they've always failed is mostly due to scarcity. So, hypothetically, with this new technological explosion, we could experience replicator technology. So a lot of people are saying, I guess scientists and biologists are saying, that like this isn't really possible. It kind of defies the laws of physics. But then other biologists are saying that, well, one already exists, the ribosome in human cells. Like I said, don't come from a science background, but the way I understand it, it takes different things and makes other things. So lack of scarcity could be solved on a global scale if we can apply that to other things other than the human cells. And we can duplicate the technology that nature has already has already come up with, I guess. So kind of not necessarily a counter to this, but just maybe we will reach a utopian society, but then we encounter this problem of utopian docility. So in that case, it would ultimately lead to dystopia. So utopian docility is just everyone's happy, everyone can have whatever they want, no one has to work, no one has to worry about money, everyone's just, living their life, and all of a sudden, technology just rapidly increases past the point of human understanding, and since humans are so happy and docile, it just can completely take over the human race. So in a dystopian society, or a dystopian view, the intelligence explosion is viewed a little bit more negatively, where software-based intelligent minds enter a runaway reaction self-improvement cycles, with each new and more intelligent generation appearing faster than its predecessor. So I guess this can be kind of linked to the utopian definition, but in this sense, this would result in complete control by super intelligent computers, which could either lead to an Orwellian society where we're just controlled by computers and constantly monitored and still living with them, but maybe just not in the happiest sense, or just the elimination of the human race, because really why are we necessary anymore if technology can take us over if it's smarter than us? So utopian, dystopian disagreement here, utopians believe that the only reason this dystopian society would emerge would be the carelessness or unethical nature of the origin of the creators, whereas the dystopians disagree and say that no, regardless of how ethical the creators of this technology are, it's the fact that technology is unstable and unknown that would lead to this dystopian society. So then there's also the possibility of multiple singularities coexisting, and that's kind of leading back to the income inequality thing, whereas if we continue on this path of income inequality, we'll have a society of the haves and the have-nots, whereas the haves can afford all this new revolutionary technology, and the have-nots cannot. They can maybe afford some of the cheaper stuff, or the haves can just afford so many things that the income just gets concentrated completely at the top, and the have-nots just kind of disappear, and it's just this society that, yeah, maybe you are in a utopian society, but at what cost, I guess you could say. And this just goes on to Hillary's presentation from Tuesday that I got a chance to watch before class today, and she just talked about the Hunger Games and how that really kind of exemplifies this in a modern movie format. So that was a really good presentation to go off of for this ultimate reality. And again, with multiple singularities coexisting, it can also expand to not just within one society, but within multiple societies. So this could be spurred from regulations, whereas maybe Canada has really strict regulations on genetic engineering or biotechnology or biointelligence, whereas another nation might not, so they might surpass us in this sense. Whereas on a global scale, there would be multiple singularities, whereas maybe one nation would either reach it first or something to do with that. Or it could lead with one nation, I guess, taking over the world, hypothetically. And then another final alternative that I'll go into would just be the fact that singularity is not reached, and the reasons that this would happen would be, I guess, human nature and industrialization. So the fact that currently we're kind of not really regarding the environment so much, kind of degrading our society, degrading our resources, and maybe we'll reach the point that everything is so degraded that kind of survival will be our main focus versus technological growth, and that could just lead to a stagnation in the current trends of technology. So whereas we're in this exponential growth curve right now, if something happens, maybe it'll just flatten out and then we'll never reach it. Or the misuse of current technology, so we have a lot of weapons, a lot of terrorism, that sort of thing going on in the world right now, and if someone misuses this technology, it could easily either end the human race or again destroy the world to a sense where survival is the main thing, not technological revolution. Or the final thing that I kind of explored was the fixation on potential dystopian outcomes. So if people start really kind of realizing that this growth is leading to this hypothetical singularity situation, and people focus on the dystopian side, they could maybe stop this technological progression willingly before it actually occurs. So I guess in conclusion, all I have to say is that kind of regardless of the final outcome of the accelerated growth and singularity, we're currently in a really serious place that where these big inequalities are occurring, and we should really be more concerned about it. And when you look at the utopia-ish, I guess, view of singularity, it really doesn't involve the social stratification that we're currently experiencing. So if we wish to see singularity achieved in its most desirable sense, it is clear we should really endeavor to close this income disparity gap before the current inevitable arrival of singularity. And then finally, I kind of added this on this morning. After I listened to Hillary's presentation from Tuesday, I listened to some of the questions that you guys were asking, and I kind of heard her opinion on it and kind of wanted to put an opinion on it from this income disparity gap problem. So she mentioned, or questions were mentioned about government spending and welfare spending. In terms of government spending, it was mentioned that the United States kind of gets a lot of their revenue from the taxes, and that is like a really important factor in their society. But just the way that different areas are taxed, the Gini index is actually, I guess, mapped out in two ways. One's pre-tax income and one's post-tax income. So in most nations, post-tax, all of the different brackets kind of stay relatively at the same level, like they'll all decrease, but all in unison, whereas in the United States, the top 1% doesn't decrease as much because they're not taxed as heavily as in other nations. So this whole tax thing just kind of is this negative feedback loop. It's really, I don't know, it's kind of a debated thing right now. And yeah, so I guess the welfare spending side of it is more prominent in developing nations, whereas if their governments are spending more on welfare, the income gap does begin to close, whereas in other nations it's not as prominent. And then, so another thing was saying using this spending or using this revenue for investing in new technologies to eventually reach the singularity. So I guess this just kind of makes me question, like, at what point do we reach the singularity? Like, during the time when we're going to reach it, are we really going to have this completely stratified society where people at the bottom are really have no say, like money is power, so they're really marginalized compared to people at the top? Does the middle and lower class even still exist by the time the singularity is reached, I guess? And do the ends really justify the means in that sense? So the means of most of society being marginalized, where the top of society isn't marginalized, is that really a reasonable thing to experience and a reasonable thing to sacrifice for the future and this hypothetical singularity that may or may not occur? And then the last thing I heard was just the whole thing of natural selection and saying that people at the top, well, they deserve to be there and that they made the money because they're smarter and they're just generally better. And this just goes back to the whole Great Gatsby index, where due to this income inequality, we're getting this lack of economic mobility. And so maybe if you are born at the bottom and you do have all these skills, you'll never be able to get out of this bottom bracket. And I guess I'll just open the floor up to any more questions you guys might have.
Okay, so questions?
Nothing? I explained everything. You guys completely understand everything about income inequality and mobility and technology. I mean, I did my best.
I'll just make a question then, since everyone else doesn't have one. You mentioned a lot about the income inequality, and I mean from like a perspective from the United States, because we can totally see their curve. They're well off, and there's this class of people who are extremely richer than everyone else. But I'm just wondering if you've looked into some other countries, perhaps like developing countries who might not have this clear gap yet that we can see, and how you think singularity might affect them.
Sure. So when I was looking at those different graphs and different measures of inequality, I did come across a lot for developing nations. And like I said, on a global scale, inequality is on the rise everywhere. There's actually this graph. Here is a decomposition of change in Gini index of the globe, of all countries involved in the Gini index. So everywhere the total change is positive. The only differentiation between developed and undeveloped nations is more where the inequality is coming from. In all nations across the board, the main contributor is technology, but in developing nations, like I said, welfare spending has more of an offsetting effect than in developed nations. In developed nations, the bigger components are more things like globalization, where, as I said, like owners of companies can outsource labor or outsource the technology and lower their costs. Therefore, they're making more money where the bottom people are making less money or no money. And that's a bigger problem in the United States, where they have access to cheap labor and cheap technology that maybe we would have never had before globalization.
That one graph that had the countries listed, and it was the one about the Gatsby index. Yeah, that one here. I noticed a few at the top, like Peru, Brazil, Chile. Like those are more developing than already developed, I would say. Like, is it like, do these developing countries then become more equal as time goes on, or is like a newly developing country, is there more inequality and then it sort of lessens as things even out? Or?
Yeah, I definitely see where you're coming from with this question. I think that what this graph doesn't illustrate is the fact that the rising inequality is kind of a newer trend since around the 70s, whereas before that, the income inequality, it was kind of a constant measure. So the fact that this is more of everyone's starting point, whereas everyone's moving towards the Peru, China, Brazil area, because everyone's Gini coefficient is rising, and as your Gini coefficient rises, the mobility also, or lack of mobility also rises. I don't know how to explain what I'm trying to say. Like the reason that Peru, China, Brazil, and Chile are there is just because that's kind of where they started at the point of this new technological revolution. They were already unequal, so the technology just has made it worse, whereas maybe they'll just get to the end points of complete polarization sooner than somewhere like the United States or Canada. Did that answer your question?
Do you think because of this inequality that in the future the utopian thing is like going to be impossible then? Because we will have different endpoints at different times.
Sorry, I missed that?
So like the utopian where everyone's equal, right? Do you think that will be impossible in the future then because of this inequality?
I think that, I guess it depends how soon it happens. If it were to happen tomorrow, I think that we're in a point kind of globally and politically that people at the top would be able to share this kind of utopian society with people near to the bottom and be more willing and open to that. Whereas maybe the further we go into the future, the wider that gap gets, the middle class is completely eliminated. There would be a complete society of have and have-nots. And I personally think in that sense, the further we get in the inequality spectrum, the more likely the situation of multiple singularities or the whole Hunger Games type thing would occur.
I just want to get sort of perspective, an opinion of a hypothetical situation, like meaning you come from a finance background, so my question is, like, what do you imagine the economics of the world would be like, say, tomorrow the singularity suddenly happened? Like, how would our economy today change to the economy of tomorrow at that period of time?
I guess it depends how you define singularity. So sorry, were you talking about singularity in general, or the utopian view, or the?
Not any specific view. Just say, like, suddenly we have this influx of technology that does everything for us, that can pretty much control the world. Like, how would humans economically respond to that?
I think it would kind of be a trickle-down situation where the people at the top, like I said, would benefit from it first and take advantage of this new technology. And then eventually, as I guess people realize that the need for money is no longer there and the need for, I guess, general economics is not there, there wouldn't be a price on the technology anymore. So really anyone could afford it. It'd be widely available, dispersed. I think that the problem right now would just be the distribution of it. And I guess if you depend singularity on the whole replicator thing, like if everyone could suddenly have a replicator tomorrow, sure, but it would take a long time to get this technology to everywhere, especially places that are less technically connected right now. Like in North America, we're very connected, but maybe somewhere on the other side of the world would be a lot more difficult.
So do you see a future without money? Do you see a future where we're all on permanent vacation, or do those things just seem ridiculous to you from your background? What did you go to school for if there's not going to be money in the future?
Exactly, right? I am honestly not sure. I think that definitely, like, reading about singularity and the utopian view, like, the way they explain it, yeah, that could happen, but I don't think that it will happen by 2045. I think that people are not happy with being docile, just human nature. There'll always be some sort of competition and some sort of monetary reward or some sort of incentive-driven society. And what that incentive will be in the future, whether it's money or something else, I'm not sure what it will be, but I'm sure that there will be something that differentiates people and that people would not be happy or successful just kind of living where anything is at the touch of your fingertips.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So this is kind of going on the lines of what Ian said about how it's going to reach a point maybe where countries become equal. Is there any foreseeable plateau as to when the developing countries will just stop developing and allow the developed countries will stop, I guess, expanding and then allow the developing countries to catch up to them? Because we've lived through, I suppose, one of the biggest economic downturns of, well, I haven't been alive that long, so I can't really say, but it's the biggest one I've lived through. And do you think there's any foreseeable time where the really developed ones will just stop and allow the little guys to catch up?
I think that in an ideal world, kind of what Hillary was touching on, just saying that our current spending, like what we're currently spending our money and our taxes on, if that was filtered into developing nations and solving poverty and things like that before solving the problem of the new smartphone, then yes. But I think that we are just so disconnected from that, kind of from a mental standpoint, that greed will still take over and that we just want more and more and more and more, and that we're not going to focus on channeling that towards developing nations because it's kind of just, it's not really right in front of us right now. So maybe as globalization increases and we all kind of just become one global society, that will be more equalized, but in, I think, the near foreseeable future, no.
I also have another question on the 2045 number. I'm just not really familiar with it. Why are people thinking it's going to be specifically 2045?
I think it has to do with Moore's law and just the extrapolation of this technological growth, that somehow someone plotted something on a graph and said, oh, look, this trend that we're on right now, 2045 is the year that we just can't, like the curve just is going to be straight up. So I think that someone just came up with that number and it just, someone stuck to it. You know, it really sunk in. Sorry? There you go. That's the one.
So what's your personal standpoint on 2045? You think we're going to reach that?
I think that if singularity happens before then, say it happens in 2041, it's not going to be like announced until 2045 because everyone wants it to happen in 2045. But in terms of just like the general date range, I'm not entirely sure. Like the more I read about it, the more I believe in it, but then it's kind of just getting a biased viewpoint. Before this, I didn't even realize that like 2045 was a number and that was so soon and that was something people were talking about before I took this class. So it's kind of still something that's fresh in my mind that I haven't formed a complete opinion on. And I don't even think that you can form an opinion on, or well, an opinion on, but like one that can be definitely the outcome, I guess.
My question's kind of towards like population. Like, if every country was equal, what would happen to population growth? Like, I know technology progresses because it's used to sustain the existing population. I mean, if population doesn't grow, what would really happen? Like, would the world kind of stay still? Because right now, poverty is linked to like higher population.
Mm-hmm. I think that in this hypothetical singularity, complete space exploration would also be an option, and we would just start colonizing the planets around us. So this rapid population growth, if that were to happen, wouldn't be a problem. But I also think that once immortality arises, the need to repopulate wouldn't really be there anymore. And that if people were to have children, it wouldn't be like at the young age of 25, 35 that we see now. Maybe like when you're 200 is when you have kids. So the kind of progression of society would slow down a lot in that sense. And then by the time people reach the age of 200 and they're having their kids, well, they can just send them to the moon. So no problem.
If everybody kind of were immortal, what would happen to our exhaustible natural resources?
Well, that's where the whole replicator thing comes into play, whereas our current problems that we're facing is scarcity. Scarcity of resources, scarcity of generally anything. So if we have this replicator that can just make stuff out of other stuff, that wouldn't be a problem anymore. The environment, anything. We wouldn't need to grow things because we could just make food, or we wouldn't need to, I guess, have trees to make oxygen. Like I said, I'm not from a science background, so I really can't wrap my brain around how that works. But from what I understand, that is what this whole idea of a replicator would kind of ensue, along with a lot of other things.
The economy would be kind of in a steady state for the rest of
exactly.
the
That's
duration.
why I think it wouldn't happen, because people wouldn't be satisfied and wouldn't be happy with this just flat, neutral thing where there's no incentives and no room for growth or differentiating yourself.
Okay, well, that's great, and I think we should move on now to Catherine's talk. So thank you very much.
Thank you.